When Edward, Duke of Kent, rose for what was meant to be a routine address, the room froze. His voice trembled not with age but with something deeper. As cameras clicked and aides shifted nervously behind him, Edward paused mid-sentence, blinking back visible emotion. What was supposed to be ceremonial turned into an unprecedented royal confession, one that sent shockwaves across the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The silence that followed his opening words was not the dignified hush of a royal function, it was raw. Edward's hand gripped the edge of the podium, as if anchoring himself from what he was about to say or from what he was trying to stop himself from saying. The crowd, a carefully selected blend of dignitaries, press and extended royals, sat unmoving, their expressions slowly shifting from polite interest to quiet alarm. The phrase "my final appearance in royal service" emerged not as a proud declaration, but as a confession weighed down by regret. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't filtered, it was real, and that reality cracked the polished surface of the monarchy's carefully cultivated image. There was no mention of health, no direct reference to age or duty fulfilled. Instead, there was a pause, a long, breathless pause. Behind Edward, two aides exchanged glances, visibly unsure whether to step in. He waved them off. His eyes seemed to search the room not for approval, but for understanding. This wasn't just a man retiring, it was a man unburdening himself, slowly and painfully, in front of the very institution he had served with unwavering silence for nearly 8 decades. That silence shattered when his voice quivered and broke mid-sentence. There was no recovery from it. He stepped back from the microphone for a moment, lowered his head, and exhaled audibly. It was not a moment of weakness, it was a moment of reckoning. Whispers began before he even finished. Had the palace approved this speech? Was Buckingham aware that Edward had gone off script? Sources later confirmed that the final version reviewed by palace aides did not include any reference to stepping down. Yet here he was saying it. Queen Camilla and Prince William, we're told, had been notified only minutes before the event began. That's not just poor coordination, that's political chaos behind royal curtains. Some insiders believe Edward had been delaying this announcement for years, not because he wasn't ready, but because the family wasn't ready for what would come with it. His retirement wasn't just an ending, it was a trigger. And whatever it was set to ignite had clearly been simmering long before this speech ever reached the public. Palace aides could be seen quietly moving closer to the stage, waiting for a natural moment to intercept. But Edward gave them none. He pushed through, each word slower, heavier, his eyes no longer avoiding the audience but confronting them. It wasn't just emotion, it was exhaustion from years of pretending everything was intact, from watching others rewrite the family's legacy while his was quietly erased. For too long, Edward had been the silent bridge between generations. But now, that bridge was crumbling, and he wasn't going to let it fall in silence. But behind the trembling voice and the final wave lay decades of unresolved tension, ghosts from the past that Edward could no longer silence. Before he was a public figure, Edward was the monarchy's most obedient shadow, sent to clean up messes, attend forgotten ceremonies, and protect the firm's image when others faltered. But that very obedience came with a cost he never dared speak aloud until now. Decades before his trembling voice stunned the room, Edward had already given more of himself to the crown than most would ever realize. He was never the loudest, never the most photographed, and certainly never the one breaking protocol. Instead, he became something far more essential to the royal machine, an instrument of containment. When scandals rippled through the family during the 1980s, it wasn't Charles or Anne dispatched to quietly soothe dignitaries or console foreign allies. It was Edward. During the Falklands aftermath, the Princess Diana media storms, the Windsor Castle fire, even the chaos of the Queen's annus horribilis, he was there, standing behind the flames, making sure the image didn't collapse completely. He wasn't the hero of the headlines, he was the one making sure those headlines didn't bring the institution down, and it began to eat at him. As younger royals stepped into the spotlight and the family dynamic shifted, Edward's role was increasingly invisible but not accidental. Palace officials knew exactly what they were doing. He was never allowed to shine too brightly. His appearances were always placed on the second tier. He would be at the state dinners, but not on the front page. He would represent the crown in countries too politically complex for the heirs, but never be listed in the official communiques. Loyalty, they told him, was its own reward. But as years passed and scandals intensified, Edward became a fallback plan. He was called in when others refused. He represented the monarchy at funerals no one else wanted to attend. He calmed volatile Commonwealth situations when Charles's image was too brittle. He did what was asked every single time, without resistance. And that silence, that unquestioned obedience, slowly became the very reason he was left behind. There was also something far colder brewing beneath the surface. Edward's relationship with Charles was always polite but never close. While the public was focused on Diana's tragedy and the Camilla controversy, few noticed the quiet tension between the two cousins. Edward, senior in both age and royal training, was frequently dismissed when it came to high-level decision-making. His suggestio NS were overlooked. His schedule was rearranged without consultation. And yet he remained present until the one moment he didn't. Behind closed doors at a private family gathering, Edward reportedly refused to shake Prince Andrew's hand. The reason was never disclosed, but insiders confirmed it followed a heated discussion about the royal family's failure to hold its own members accountable. That moment, brief but symbolic, marked a turning point in Edward's personal threshold for tolerance, and buried even deeper was a truth Edward never dared share publicly until now. His private journals, written in near-perfect cursive and guarded for decades, reportedly contained passages of quiet bitterness. Not rage, not vengeance, but exhaustion. Page after page detailing what it felt like to give everything, only to watch his legacy be reduced to footnotes and filler roles. Not because he wasn't capable, but because he was too compliant, too loyal, too willing to be erased for the sake of the firm's image. And in his final appearance, when his voice cracked and the world watched him falter, it wasn't weakness on display, it was decades of restraint finally collapsing. Yet the deepest fracture wasn't between brothers or cousins, it was buried in a single royal decision that rewrote Edward's future forever. Few remember the alternative succession plan whispered in corridors during the Queen's early reign, one that would have placed Edward, not Charles, closer to the throne. Buried in old correspondence and long-forgotten pledges, this secret poisoned Edward's loyalty from within. In the earliest years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, there existed a plan, private, speculative, but drafted with enough seriousness to be quietly discussed among select aides and courtiers. It was called a contingency, a safeguard, in case the crown's future wavered. If Charles, young and still unshaped by duty, proved unfit or unwilling to carry the burden, another royal would step forward. That man, according to more than one archived communication, was Edward. A polished soldier, a silent strategist, a blood royal trusted by the Queen and respected by the Commonwealth. In one handwritten note allegedly preserved in a locked Windsor drawer, Queen Elizabeth reportedly thanked Edward for his readiness to serve in any capacity the realm requires, regardless of line or blood. That phrase, regardless of line, has haunted his legacy ever since. Prince Philip, however, did not share the sentiment. He believed in a clear, unshakable succession. Charles was the heir, and any plan that suggested otherwise, even hypothetically, was a betrayal of order. What began as a quiet possibility soon turned into a wedge. Edward, once a favoured confidant of his aunt and uncle, found himself increasingly pushed to ceremonial margins. The contingency was never formally revoked, because it had never been formally announced. But over the years, Edward watched it disintegrate not with a proclamation, but with deliberate silence. His name was gradually erased from private meetings about the future. His suggestions were welcomed with courtesy, but never action. And when he began to sense that even the Queen was distancing herself from what had once been a promise, something inside him changed. By the time Charles divorced Diana and Camilla began her re-entry into public life, Edward had long stopped expecting clarity. But the acceptance of Camilla into the heart of the firm struck a nerve that no one truly understood. To Edward, it wasn't just about marriage or scandal, it was about legacy. He had waited, served, and stood ready, while others made choices that endangered the monarchy's moral authority. And yet now, those very choices were being legitimized, praised even, while he remained in the shadows. Not long after Charles and Camilla's roles were solidified, Edward reportedly began removing personal belongings from Clarence House quietly, without press, without ceremony. A symbolic withdrawal, a protest no one dared name aloud. One senior aide later admitted that Edward had once been told he would receive greater responsibility should Charles ever prove too volatile for the throne. That promise, vague as it was, became an emotional prison. He never spoke of it publicly, but in private notes passed to legal advisers, Edward documented a timeline of decisions that slowly buried the role he was once groomed for. His bitterness was never loud. It festered, buried deep beneath perfect posture and quiet smiles. While others revelled in newfound titles and power, Edward's devotion became a ghostly burden, one he carried until it broke him. As Queen Camilla restructured the royal court and Catherine ascended to near unquestioned prominence, Edward found himself increasingly excluded. But this wasn't just about age, it was about legacy, loyalty, and a silent punishment for truths no one dared acknowledge. Once a fixture of royal engagements and diplomatic ceremonies, Edward's presence began to vanish from programs without explanation. His name, once printed with ceremonial weight, was quietly omitted from orders of precedence and foreign delegation lists. It began subtly, his attendance at military commemorations suddenly delegated, his portrait relocated from prominent halls to lesser corridors. But Edward noticed. He always noticed. And what appeared to be administrative reshuffling was, in his eyes, a quiet removal piece by piece, until the institution could pretend he'd never mattered at all. Tensions escalated when Camilla's newly appointed senior aide allegedly clashed with Edward over seating protocol at a private royal reception. Edward, by birth and service, expected certain deference. What he received was a dismissive instruction and a lowered chair. Catherine's rapid rise only intensified the isolation. While the public celebrated her growing command of royal duties, inside the firm, her ascendancy came with structural consequences. Entire ceremonial additions Edward had long upheld were now reassigned, reimagined, or abandoned altogether in favour of modern optics. Edward, ever the guardian of continuity, felt displaced not by time, but by design. In conversations with close staff, he is said to have mourned the erasure of quiet history, the kind built not on headlines, but on consistency, loyalty, and silent service. And yet, silence had become his cage. Every protest he dared raise was met with polite deflection. Every question about his diminishing role was met with vague promises of future inclusion that never came. Even more damning was the exclusion of his wife, Catherine. Once included in sensitive family briefings and ceremonial planning, she was now left uninformed, often learning about major changes through press releases rather than family memos. To Edward, this wasn't just a protocol misstep. It was a targeted decision, one that stripped his household of relevance and reminded him, in the most deliberate ways, that the new generation had no intention of preserving his legacy. The Order of the Garter service, held with pomp and ritual just a year ago, became the most public fracture. Edward was seen arriving alone, his procession rerouted, and his position altered at the last moment. Sources confirmed it was not a logistical error. It was a deliberate reshuffling, one Edward endured with a clenched jaw and silent fury. These exclusions weren't about schedules or simplification. They were about rewriting histo. In real time. And Edward, who had once been the monarchy's most reliable safeguard, was now being painted as expendable, not because he failed, but because he remembered too much, because he had been present during too many secrets, too many compromises, and too many conversations that the current royal court wanted forgotten. His marginalization wasn't punishment for disloyalty. It was fear of what loyalty, when pushed too far, might eventually expose. But the emotional distance wasn't the only thing unraveling it, was a looming secret, one that Edward was never supposed to reveal. Locked in a mahogany drawer inside Edward's Kensington study were pages of a handwritten journal. It wasn't just a personal diary, it was a record of conversations, betrayals, and suppressed royal truths. and someone tried, very quietly, to make them disappear. The existence of Edward's private journals had long been rumoured among a small circle of palace aides, but their contents had never been confirmed until now. Page after page, written in a style unmistakably his, offered a raw, unfiltered chronicle of royal life behind closed doors. This wasn't a diary of ceremonial engagements or distant reflections. It was a ledger of power plays, of whispered warnings, of names that carried weight and consequences. One section, dated weeks after Princess Diana's tragic death, recounted a closed-door meeting in which Charles's conduct had been called into question by multiple advisers. Edward, silent during the session, wrote later that he watched those responsible for healing instead carve out protection for themselves. That line alone would have caused panic at the highest levels, but it was far from the only one. He named them individuals within the palace structure who, in his words, used protocol to punish loyalty, advisers who manipulated seating orders to signal exclusion, secretaries who buried invitations, aides who reshaped official narratives while silencing dissenting voices. Edward had documented it all, not for vengeance, but for preservation. He had spent decades holding his tongue while others rewrote history around him, and this journal was his only act of resistance. One passage, striking in its clarity, referenced Queen Elizabeth's quiet fears about Camilla's rise, not as a personal issue, but as a threat to the monarchy's perceived moral foundation. It was the kind of observation no one dared speak publicly. Yet there it was in ink, from a man who had stood closest to the storm. Even more unnerving were Edward's recollections of private conversations with Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. In one chilling entry, he quoted her saying that Princess Anne was being gently written out of the future. Sophie, once regarded as a bridge between generations, had herself become wary of the court's direction. Edward never commented on her claim, but the fact that he recorded it at all suggested he believed it would matter one day. And that day was coming faster than nay expected. Weeks before his final announcement, a mysterious fire alarm triggered an emergency response at Edward's residence. The cause, officially labelled as a system fault, has since been classified under internal security protocols. But insiders confirmed that during the confusion, a locked study drawer had been tampered with. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear: someone knew what lay inside. Edward's lawyer, an old friend with no formal palace ties, later confirmed privately that attempts had been made to secure and relocate personal documents tied to institutional memory. The language was vague on purpose, but the implication was unmistakable. The diary was no longer just a personal artifact, it was a liability, one that could unravel decades of carefully guarded image-making. And as Edward's final speech neared, pressure mounted from within the firm, not to silence him completely, but to ensure whatever he said could be contained. But it wasn't just what Edward had written, it was who else had read those words that sent the palace into a quiet panic. 2 days before his announcement, Edward received an unexpected visitor, his cousin, Princess Anne. What transpired behind closed doors was never recorded, but palace insiders described tears, hand-holding, and a whispered phrase that left Edward visibly changed. No formal appointment had been made, no staff were briefed. Anne arrived in silence, without her usual security detail, dressed not for ceremony but for privacy. She entered through the back corridor of Edward's residence, a path reserved for moments that were never meant to be seen. For over a year, the two cousins had not shared a private conversation, not because of conflict, but because the distance between them had grown into something difficult to navigate, an unspoken tension born not of betrayal, but of pain. Both had served longer than most, endured more than most, and been pushed aside more quietly than most. But on that evening, Anne came not as the Princess Royal, but as a sister in arms, carrying the weight of their shared legacy in her voice. What was said between them remains protected by silence, but those who saw Edward afterwards knew something had shifted. According to one aide, Anne told him plainly, "They'll erase everything if you don't speak." It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. A reminder that history is written by those who survive it, not always by those who built it. Edward, who had carried so much with so little recognition, had reached the edge of becoming invisible. Anne knew that feeling too well. Her counsel wasn't about vengeance, it was about preservation. She reminded him of the quiet sacrifices, the unacknowledged roles, the truth that had been layered over by narratives more convenient to the current generation. And when she reached across the small table between them, Edward took her hand. He didn't speak. He simply opened a nearby drawer and pulled out a small sapphire ring once belonging to their mother. He held it, not like an heirloom, but like a lifeline. For several minutes neither of them said a word. The silence between them held decades. Childhood summers at Balmoral, grief after Margaret's fall from grace, quiet nods exchanged during family ceremonies where neither of them truly belonged anymore. Anne, hardened by years of public stoicism, reportedly teared up, and in that rare, fragile moment, she is said to have told him, "Break the silence, Ted, while it still matters, before they make it disappear." And that was all. She stood. He didn't stop her. She left the way she came unseen. But Edward was no longer the same. The next morning his entire demeanour had changed. Staff described him as resolute, focused, almost rehearsed, but not in the way of royal briefings, in the way of a man who Dee finally decided to stop waiting for permission. He reviewed his remarks alone, declined edits, requested no press embargo. Whatever had been locked inside him had cracked open and the flood was coming. That conversation cracked the dam, but what would be released was something no one in the royal family could control. A long-buried file from 1996, codenamed Operation Sandlass, outlined emergency succession measures in case of multiple abdications or incapacitations. And at its centre, Edward. Until now it was dismissed as fiction, but new leaks show the memo is very real and very damning. It was never intended to surface. Hidden deep within the Windsor archives, buried beneath layers of outdated legislation and ceremonial drafts, the document existed in silence for nearly 3 decades. But what was unearthed just weeks before Edward's public breakdown wasn't speculation, it was confirmation. Operation Sandlass had been quietly prepared during a particularly volatile period in the monarchy's history, when the crown was still reeling from the aftermath of Diana's divorce, and public trust was nearing collapse. The memo, drafted with the backing of Queen Elizabeth herself and signed off by the then Lord Chamberlain, did not name Charles as the sole contingency figure in case of constitutional emergency. Instead, it referenced Edward by name, by role, and by trust as the designated supportive heir. The phrasing was deliberate. It didn't challenge the line of succession. But it did create a shadow command structure, should the monarchy face a situation too politically fragile to be handled by the direct heir alone. The file would have remained in obscurity if not for a chain of events triggered during the Queen's final months. As her health began to visibly decline, certain legacy documents were quietly reviewed, reassessed, and in some cases, removed entirely from the Royal Archive catalogue. Insiders now revealed that Charles himself requested access to a classified batch of succession files, among them Sandlass. What he read reportedly left him livid. While the full details have not been released, sources confirm that Charles made a personal order for the file to be physically secured and reframed for legal interpretation. But the damage had already been done. A digital duplicate, long thought deleted, was quietly handed to 2 royal biographers by an anonymous courier. Both writers, previously discredited by the palace for their fringe theories, suddenly found themselves holding the most explosive document in modern royal history. Even more shocking is the revelation that Edward had no knowledge of the memo's full scope until last year. He had heard whispers of a special advisory clause. He had suspected he was once a fallback. But he never knew that the Queen had authorized such a detailed instruction, placing him in a silent role meant to stabilize the monarchy if everything else collapsed. The betrayal wasn't just the secrecy, it was the deletion. Camilla's legal advisors, upon discovering the memo's implications, reportedly pushed for a private ruling on whether the document could be declared non-binding under modern succession law. A move not to erase the file, but to neuter it, to strip it of any symbolic power before it could be used. Edward, meanwhile, was left reeling. Not because he desired the throne, but because he had given his entire life to a system that never trusted him enough to be honest. A system that had prepared for his leadership behind closed doors, only to deny it publicly, erase it strategically, and bury it with intent. And now, with the memo in the hands of writers the firm had spent years discrediting, the fear wasn't about protocol, it was about perception. The public didn't need to believe Edward was meant to rule. They only needed to believe the palace had something to hide. And as the web of secrecy unraveled, Edward realized his final appearance had to serve one last mission, revealing the monarchy's deepest betrayal. In his trembling voice, Edward revealed what no other royal had dared say aloud. Not scandal, not gossip, but a declaration of truth, dignity, and a demand for history to remember. What he said wasn't just unexpected, it was seismic. With every word, the illusion cracked. Edward, long regarded as the monarchy's most dutiful footnote, shattered the script in real time. He began not with grievance but with legacy, and then, without pause, questioned the very arch. A texture that defined royal remembrance. The merit of memory, he called it, an unseen scale by which the royal family chooses who is remembered and who is erased. There was no anger in his voice. Only the weight of decades spent watching those who gave everything be reduced to ceremonial shadows. He didn't name them all. He didn't have to. The term lost generation hung in the air like a blade cutting through the silence as he listed those who had served, sacrificed, and vanished from the palace's official version of history. Cousins, spouses, soldiers in royal uniform. Names once printed in programs, now scrubbed from the story. But the room truly froze when he spoke of Diana, not as a figure of tragedy but of integrity. She was not perfect, he said, but she was a compass for courage. It wasn't applause he was seeking. It was acknowledgement of the sacrifices made by those who were left unprotected by the institution they once served. He didn't speak as a rebel. He spoke as someone who had tried to remain loyal until loyalty became complicity. The most chilling moment came when he hinted at private promises made by the Queen Mother, promises to preserve the truth of what had been whispered, but never recorded. A legacy of silence that, he now believed, was destroying everything it once tried to protect. The emotional crescendo surged as he declared, clearly and without hesitation, that his retirement was not a matter of age, but the result of exhaustion born from silence. No euphemism, no palace-filtered phrasing, just a stark truth: he could no longer be the quiet guardian of a family that refused to face itself. And then, without a single bow or gesture of protocol, he stepped away from the podium. Cameras captured his final words, but not the storm they would ignite behind palace walls. For decades, every speech had ended the same way, with a nod to service and continuity, but not this one. Edward walked off stage with no fanfare, no royal wave, and no permission. He walked off as a man, not a duke, and for the first time as someone finally choosing to be heard. But while Edward had said his final piece, one more twist remained: a quiet maneuver already underway inside the palace gates. Within 48 hours of Edward's speech, a sealed section of the Queen Mother's private archives was accessed for the first time since 2002. No announcement, no press release. But something within had suddenly become urgent. Behind the scenes, the order came swiftly. Charles's private secretary, operating under what insiders described as extraordinary authority, instructed a senior member of the Royal Archives to bypass the standard clearance chain. The file in question had been untouched for over 2 decades, preserved under a confidentiality clause that even the Queen herself had reportedly vowed to uphold until after a full generational transition. And yet, suddenly, the vault was unsealed. The section bore no official label, only a coded inventory entry marked with the initials Ina, long assumed to represent Edward and Anne. According to those familiar with its contents, the archive contained not only handwritten letters and memos, but also several audio recordings, private conversations, dictated reflections, and correspondence once thought to have been lost or destroyed in the shuffle of time. What had triggered the scramble? Sources say it wasn't Edward's speech alone, but the timing of its release alongside media whispers that two royal biographers had obtained portions of a classified document known as Operation Sandlass. Suddenly, legacy wasn't just a matter of tradition, it had become a legal and reputational risk. The Queen Mother's documents, sealed with her own hand in her final years, were rumoured to include not just historical reflections but personal assessments of each royal's character, potential and trustworthiness. One document, insiders claim, bluntly warned of structural fractures ahead should truth be edited to suit succession. That line alone could unravel the stability the firm had so carefully rebuilt. Legal teams were reportedly summoned the moment the vault was opened, not to challenge the document's existence, but to assess how much of their content could ever be suppressed if leaked. Even more unsettling was the reported exclusion of Catherine and William from the loop. While senior royals were quietly briefed, the Prince and Princess of Wales were allegedly left in the dark until a full day after the access had taken place. It was a silence that raised more questions than answers. Were they being shielded or deliberately sidelined? Their absence from a situation involving Edward and Anne, the two remaining guardians of the Queen Mother's private trust, suggested a fracture in royal unity far deeper than the public had been led to believe. And then came the image that would define the palace's panic: a lone royal courier seen exiting the archive building just past midnight. He said nothing. He answered no questions. But those who saw him described him as pale, shaken, and holding a sealed case tighter than protocol required. Whatever he carried wasn't just delicate, it was dangerous. The monarchy's silence in the days that followed only confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. Edward hadn't just disrupted a tradition, he had triggered a reckoning. And the documents now in circulation, both inside the palace and possibly beyond it, represented a truth too long buried. Truths about promises made and broken, about heirs chosen and erased, about the real weight of silence passed down like a crown too heavy to bear. As the monarchy scrambles to regain control, Edward, now removed from duty, remains the only one who truly understands what those sealed pages could destroy. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.